Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Therapy Alchemist podcast. Today I have a very special guest that I am so excited for you guys to listen to. He is my mentor and somebody that I fangirl over because of his podcast, Back from the Abyss, Psychiatry and Stories. I have on today Dr. Craig Heacock, and he is a psychiatrist who has worked in the field for over 20 years. And he provides ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So we talk a lot about psychedelics, ketamine, psilocybin, things like that, how they help mental health. And at the end of this episode, there is a special little surprise. So you guys definitely need to listen because there's going to be something that's really going to shock you. All right, let's begin. Welcome to the Therapy Alchemist podcast. I'm your host, Katrina Austin, a licensed therapist. I'm here to talk not only about the science behind mental health, but the magical process of transformation. Dr. Heacock, I'm so glad that you're on my podcast today. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Katrina.
So today we're going to talk about psychedelics. So you use ketamine in your practice. And so I want to start with figuring out like what it is that led you to use ketamine and psychedelics in your practice.
Okay. Well, ketamine is kind of a funny story. In 2016, I was working at the Wholeness Center in Fort Collins, which was started by Scott Shannon, a psychiatrist. And Scott's a real adventurer and sort of he's always looking for the new thing. And I remember this would have been 2016, and he came up to me out of the blue and he said, we should start doing ketamine. And I said, what? I mean, I'd heard of it. It was just starting to kind of become a thing in psychiatry. I said, well, isn't that seem a little sketchy? We're just gonna start. He said, yeah, we'll figure it out. So we did maybe a 60-minute Zoom call with a ketamine expert in California, and then he said, all right, let's do it. So and I was thinking, I don't know. He said, yeah, we'll figure it out. So we just ordered a bunch of ketamine, got a bunch of syringes, and we just started doing it. And, you know, I think of myself as fairly skeptical. In some ways, I think part of the Western medical training is to teach us to be skeptical, like show me the evidence. Mm-hmm. So I first started using it really only with suicidal patients because I thought, okay, there's some decent evidence that ketamine helps with suicidality. And then I found that most of them had radical improvement within 12, 24 hours.
Wow.
And so then I started thinking, well, maybe we should do this with people who were very depressed, but maybe not necessarily suicidal. And I found that many of them had really amazing responses. And then I thought, well, maybe we should use this with people with mixed state of bipolar and see what that looks like. And then maybe I should try it with people who have severe depression coming out of trauma. And then I just started expanding the palette and finding that it didn't help everything, but there were a lot of very difficult to treat syndromes that were responding really well to ketamine. So now it's become a staple of my practice. 2017, 7 years ago when I started, again, just for my suicidal folks, but now it's one of the primary. I mean, I'm not a ketamine clinic. I do full general psychiatry, psychotherapy, and meds and everything. But we're using it a lot because it's an amazing tool. And I often struggle to remember what it was like to not have ketamine available. Because most of my career it wasn't available, and I think the answer was pre-ketamine. I was hospitalizing way more people. People were on way more meds, and I think a lot of my most ill people were just suffering a lot more.
Wow, that's huge. That's a huge shift. So what would you say, like from your past 7 years of doing it, what's the biggest or the most significant mental health disorders that it treats?
I would say people with, number one, people with any kind of bipolar spectrum depression. So people with bona fide, depressive episode in part of bipolar 1 or 2, and we can talk about the problems with those designations. And one way to think about bipolar spectrum depression, I think of it as people with hypersomnia, oversleeping, often seasonal worsening, the kind of people that sort of hibernate in the winter and just want to hide out till spring, which is a very common kind of depression and one that's actually fairly hard to treat. That is an incredible sweet spot of ketamine. I think people who are developing severe depressive symptoms and suicidality out of trauma, ketamine treats that really well. think people that have the more traditional, what we call unipolar or major depressive disorder with more insomnia and depression, I think ketamine is often helpful. I think it's not typically as helpful with the people with hypersomnia. Ketamine is very stimulating, very activating, and there's something about that kind of depressive syndrome where people are, again, just all shut down and wanting to sleep 14, 16 hours. Ketamine is it's like jumping the car on the road, just like wakes them up and pulls them out of it.
Whoa, that's so cool. So what was your first experience like with like your first patient that you did ketamine on or used ketamine with?
Yeah,
That must have been intimidating.
Yeah, well, this is really funny. So there are very delineated differences between what doctors do and what nurses do. So one of the things that nurses do, nurses give shots. Doctors don't give shots for the most part. So I gave a couple shots in medical school. But anyway, when we started, Scott and I thought about doing this, I said to Scott, I said, I'm going to have to learn how to give an intramuscular injection. So I watched a couple of YouTube videos. And then my medical assistant, I said, can you just show me how to do a deltoid, intramuscular injection here in the upper arm? So she showed me, but oh my gosh, the first, I don't know, 20 times, hands shaking, like, just trying not to let the patient know like how nervous I was to stick this big needle in their deltoid muscle. Yeah, but I got more and more confident. One of the things that was really cool, the first 2 years I did all intramuscular, I did it myself, and I stayed in the room with the person the whole time. So now in my clinic, I usually do ketamine infusions, and I have a medical assistant who's with people when they're deep in it, and then I come sit with them as they're coming out. But in those first couple of years, the hundreds of sessions, I sat there the whole hour 15 minutes with them as they were deep in it. So that was this kind of a crash course residency in ketamine treatment. I got to see what works, what doesn't, what to do, what not to do. Because again, Scott and I were just literally figuring it out on the fly. And that was really valuable. And now one of the things I've tried to do on my podcast, Back from the Abyss, is put the word out about all the things I've learned that work and that don't work, because there were definitely some major mistakes made. Luckily, nobody got really hurt or died, but ketamine is not without risks. And when we were getting going those early years, there just weren't many people doing ketamine, so we would just try to figure it out on the fly.
Yeah, I mean, you were pretty much a pioneer of using ketamine in a practice, like one of the first group of people to start using it, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think there were a couple other places in Denver in 2017 when Scott and I started. But yeah, there was very few places in Colorado then. Now it's all over, but
yeah.
And now there's training programs. In fact, there's three or four different good training programs on the Front Range of Colorado. Back in 2016, nothing.
Yeah. Wow.
Video call with an expert.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so good that you were brave to try it out, because I mean, it sounds like it's impacted your clients' lives or your patients' lives so much, and like, what would you say is some of the most surprising or unexpected outcomes of using ketamine?
Well, this still surprises me, thousands of sessions later, but I regularly have people who are very suicidal. The kind of people that I think, if this doesn't work, we're going to have to put you in a locked psychiatric unit. And, 98 times out of 100, within 12 hours, the suicidality is gone.
Wow.
And we see this all the time. And it's become sort of commonplace, but it still surprises me. And there's people that come in, I think, okay, really, I should be putting you in the hospital, but a couple hours, we have an opening, we can put you in the chair and give you an infusion and see. And again, if given at the right dose and the right context with the right clinical presentation, ketamine it keeps people out of the hospital. I mean, it's really miraculous.
Wow.
I think another thing that's really cool is, and again, I see this all the time, but it's really wild to watch, is that ketamine opens up the psyche. It's psycholytic, and that's true at low doses of ketamine or big doses. So a lot of people that are doing ketamine treatment with me are doing it for serious trauma. I mean, specifically for the depression coming out of serious trauma. But after the sessions, they just open up and things just, pour out of them. Emotion pours out and memories. And and then for days after that, people are just are very resourced, if you will, but also just kind of broken open, but in a way that makes them very, very good therapy candidates. You know, some of the most powerful therapy sessions, whether it's EMDR or talk therapy or somatic therapy or IFS, can happen in those. It doesn't have to happen right after ketamine. It can happen days after ketamine. There's a window of 5 or 6 days, often after a higher dose ketamine treatment, where people are, again, very opened up, but very resourced, and they can handle going deeper into therapy than they normally would.
When you say resourced, what do you mean?
I mean, yeah, it's such a difficult word to explain psychologically. When I say resourced, I mean their fight flight dialed down, so like they're in a calmer state where they can manage stuff. I also mean that their resilience is dialed up, because I think we all have sort of at our healthy state, we all have different levels of resilience, but even the most neurotic of us have some resilience. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that trauma and just psychiatric stuff can do is just wear us down and just drain our trauma tank. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm sorry, I mean our resilience tank. So one of the things I tell people with ketamine treatments, I said, if you could imagine like you with like filled up with resilience and be able to handle stuff. Like oftentimes you come to ketamine and your resilience is just, and there's nothing left. And that often inversely correlates with overwhelm. You know, sort of like overwhelm goes up as resilience goes down. And one of the things people say most frequently after ketamine is that they feel much less overwhelmed. And I think that's part of being resourced, if you will, is that the overwhelm's dialed down, the resilience is dialed up, the fight flight is calmed, and so people are in a sort of in a more present moment, peaceful place where they can do hard things, whether that's, you know, walk the dog and they've not been able to walk the dog, or whether that means to do some exposure in EMDR that they have not been able to handle because it was just too hot.
What do they say happened for them? Like if there's like a theme that you've noticed, what happens for them during the ketamine treatment? Like what is their experience?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we should differentiate lower dose ketamine and higher psychedelic dose. So lower dose ketamine, we're usually talking about oral ketamine, troches or lozenges, maybe 100, 200 milligrams-ish. And that's very different what I'm doing in my office. I'm doing higher dose, what I would call psychedelic or fully dissociative dose ketamine, IV infusions and intramuscular. What happens in my office with those psychedelic sessions is as the ketamine starts to take effect, people lose awareness of the room and their bodies and their ego and their past and future, and they move into a state of pure awareness. But as this is happening, there's a wild, multi-dimensional journey that can be slow and peaceful and drifting. It could be spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. One of the main side effects, if you will, of higher dose ketamine is motion sickness, because the ketamine experience, the psychedelic ketamine, is a wild journey, and for some people can feel like the craziest roller coaster on the planet times 10.
Wow.
Other people describe it more as a floating, drifty, pleasant feeling, but it can be tough. And I think the other two big side effects of psychedelic dose ketamine would be it can raise your blood pressure, but number 3, it can get scary. And so we do a fair amount of prep around dose selection, getting people sort of psychologically ready for the fact that they are going often, not always often, on a pretty wild ride.
So,
but again, what happens in that wild ride, it's so different. You know, I've done over 3,000 sessions now, and I mean, it's so fascinating. The exact same dose, one person says, oh, I was just in this sort of purple glowing floaty river and the stars were twinkling over me and I just felt very held and loved. And other people say, oh, when the ketamine took effect, I plunged to the center of the earth, I splintered apart, I was stretched into infinity, I snapped back into like cork level sized being, and then I was spun on a centrifuge, and then I was extruded into a volcano. And I mean,
wow.
And other people, like, I saw my dead dog, you know. I think the only thing that ties it all together, the higher dose ketamine, is that It's very powerful. It's very opening. It's and it's often very physical, meaning that you can feel your body being moved and stretched and squished, and that there's a ton of movement. Oftentimes really wild movement.
Are they actually moving like physically, or is
No.
this all mentally? So they're just
All
like
mentally.
laying still and a
Yeah.
lot is happening.
Yeah, they could feel like they are falling to the center of the earth, or again, like they're being stretched out like a 10 million light year long rubber band and then snapped back down to subatomic level, or
Wow.
spun on a cosmic centrifuge, or maybe just floating peacefully in an asteroid belt.
So how is that healing?
Well, I think we have to be really careful and humble about how we talk about healing, because how is lithium healing? Well, we can say lithium works on ion channels and it promotes new brain cell growth and stabilizes mood, blah blah blah. But at the core level, like, how is lithium healing? That's very complicated. How is psychotherapy healing? Oh, it reestablishes trust and kind of reworks transferential stuff from childhood. But when you ask people, how is your psychotherapy healing? People have a lot of trouble putting words to it. So then we get in the realm of psychedelics, including ketamine. How does ketamine heal? Again, we could say, well, it improves deep sleep, which is true, or it sensitizes endorphin receptors, which is true. It causes new brain cell growth and BDNF production is true. So we can talk about neurochemically, or we can say it allows deep material from unconscious to come to the surface, which we can work on, which seems true. It allows people to face things they haven't faced before. It fills up your resilience bucket. It dials down your overwhelm. But you see, we either talk in metaphor, or we talk in psychological terms, or we talk in these neurochemical terms. But really, it's pretty mysterious. Like most everything in psychiatry, mental health, which is one of the reasons I love it. I think it's one of the reasons a lot of med students don't want to do psychiatry, because they feel like this is so mysterious and black box. And but I think people drawn to mental health and psychiatry and psychology love the mystery of it. So again, we can list all sorts of ways that ketamine, quote unquote, works, but I think it works in those ways and in ways that we just don't have words for. And I think it works in different ways for different people. There's this kind of saying in ketamine therapy that ketamine sort of takes you where you need to go. I mean, you hear that in a lot of psychedelic work. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Again, if it's dosed properly and the preparation is good and if the context is safe, I think that's true. I think it can also take people to horrible, scary places, or to awful bouts of motion sickness. Again, especially if you're not adequately prepared.
Sure.
But having some humility when we talk about how ketamine, quote unquote, works, or how psilocybin works, or even how psychotherapy works. That's complicated.
It is. And that's why I named my podcast The Therapy Alchemist, because I love that it's like, that's one of the main things I've learned about talk therapy is the change happens just magically. Like I could say the same thing to multiple clients and like one of them takes something away from it and the other person doesn't, so like it's just interesting how the mind works. So I'm with you on that. Like I love the art behind working with people, because it's just never consistently the same, but you get to watch people just like change and mold and grow. And so it's kind of cool that like you have this other thing that you can incorporate in there to kind of like fast track that, which is amazing. So speaking of psilocybin, because psilocybin is one of the things that I'm like a huge fan of getting to know more about. And I've had several clients who have used psilocybin recreationally. But what are your thoughts on psilocybin?
On psilocybin, all things psilocybin, or psilocybin
Heck,
psychiatrically?
Psychiatrically, yeah.
We'll say psychiatrically. I think psilocybin's going to have a really cool place in mental health treatment and psychiatry. I think we're still trying to figure out what that is. I think preliminary research and anecdotal evidence suggests that psilocybin's going to have a real place in treating trauma, that it has some really interesting utility in treating the OCD syndromes, including body dysmorphia and all things OCD, that it has a really interesting place in working with different kinds of existential despair, including death anxiety and disconnection and kind of the despair that goes with that. How much is psilocybin going to play a role in, you know, treating the endogenous mood disorders like bipolar disorder? That's not clear yet. So I'm really excited. You know, the decriminalization and now emerging medicalization of Colorado, or of psilocybin in Colorado, is thrilling. And I do think the overall safety of psilocybin is encouraging. I think MDMA is hopefully coming online federally within the next few months. We're looking at FDA approval, hopefully within the next 4 to 6 months. You know, MDMA has a lot more potential downsides, medication interactions, cautions, warnings. Again, not that things can't go badly with psilocybin, but I do think in general it's pretty safe, and I think it's not likely when used medically to make people worse. Because that's a big deal. You know, some of the powerful psychedelics can make people way worse. Again, not to diminish that couldn't happen with psilocybin, but it's essentially non-toxic. Can it trigger psychosis? Yeah, but mostly when combined with THC. I think you and I are going to talk about THC a little later.
Yeah.
And, you know, one could argue that the legalization of THC has brought on one of the most powerful psychoactive drugs and psychiatrically destabilizing drugs that we've yet seen. But anyway, back to psilocybin. I'm super excited about it. A lot of my patients are asking about it. My take on psilocybin, though, is in general, if you have a significant psychiatric history, psychedelic-wise, I think it's better to start with ketamine. I think ketamine is better overall for quote-unquote depression and depressive syndromes. I think there's more evidence. I think for sure ketamine has way fewer medication interactions. Ketamine's been used extensively now, millions of times, not just in psychiatry, but it's been used for 50 years extensively in anesthesia. So I think of ketamine as a better starter material, and then possibly, you know, psilocybin later.
Wow. Yeah, I find them both fascinating. I mean, how I grew up was, you know, down in the Bible Belt. And so like any kind of drug use was just so frowned upon. And then I get out here and I realize that there are so many healing properties to what humans used to do back in the past. You know, all of these like, you know, different psychedelics that medicine men would use to treat people, you know, and it's really amazing. And I think, especially with psilocybin, what you said about it being this like safer option, that has been huge for me. Because, you know, my fear is that somebody will get worse with doing any kind of psychedelic. You know, that's obviously a big fear. But, you know, people that I have talked to who have used psilocybin and gone on trips, even if they have a bad trip, there's still some sort of a powerful outcome. Like I had a roommate once who said that he had he did a psilocybin trip his first time out in the woods, you know, and then halfway through the person he was with panicked. So then he went into a panic, and like the next like 4 hours or whatever was just horrible. But he said that he was suicidal before using psilocybin. And even though his trip was bad, he was never suicidal again. And this was multiple years later that I talked to him. And I'm like, that is so crazy that you can even have a bad trip and still take away something beautiful out of it, you know. And even just like the microdosing of psilocybin, I just find wildly fascinating, because it just kind of, you know, opens up your mind to see things as they are. That's kind of the best way I know how to describe it, is like seeing the obvious, you know, like really random. I know it sounds really weird unless you've experienced it, but it's like, you know, people can tell you all day long, like, well, you know, if this negative thought is just causing you emotional pain, and you're like, yeah, I get it, but you don't get it. And, you know, I feel like psilocybin can kind of help in those ways of just like opening your mind to be like, oh, I can choose my thoughts. And it just like, it takes away the muck of, I don't know, whatever it is that's like clogging the pores to healing. I don't know how else to explain it, but I find it so fascinating. And I love this, I don't want to say safety around it, but like the lack of, potential harm, I guess, around it.
Right. I mean, if you took enough ketamine, you could die. I mean, people have died from, You take enough MDMA, you could die. You know, if you take too many mushrooms, I think you could throw up. You could have a scary trip, but you're not going to die. So that's, I mean, again, there's other harms besides toxicity and death, but you know, psilocybin mushrooms are not ever fatal.
Yeah.
And by themselves, again, I guess you could run out into traffic or something, but
Sure.
but you know, that's pretty rare. Like you know, ibuprofen at 4 times the therapeutic dose can be fatal. You know, Tylenol at 4 times the therapeutic dose can be fatal. Maybe 8 times the therapeutic dose, but and then too, there's this whole other realm, which isn't really psychiatric, it's more psychological, but the idea of reconnecting people to nature, to the biosphere, to the world, to others, that I think psilocybin can do most powerfully. I had an episode of my podcast this year called Love and Therapy, where I talked to Adele LaFrance, who's a psychologist in Denver. She does something called the Love Project. It's a really fascinating study where she's looking at experiences of love on psychedelics. And she said the early results of her study showed that of all the kinds, the deepest experience of love that people described on psychedelics, the number one focus of that love was towards all other beings. And of all the different psychedelics that people reported using in her study, the number one that brought on these incredibly powerful feelings of love towards all of the other beings was psilocybin. You know, I thought she was going to say MDMA being you know, the love drug, but she said no. The overwhelming winner, if you will, was psilocybin as the substance, and the overwhelming winner, the recipient of love, was all other beings.
Wow. Yes.
Which, how amazing is that?
So amazing. It makes me wonder, because I know that I've heard of, I think it's underground therapists who are doing this. I don't know if this is legal anywhere in the world, where for couples therapy, they're using MDMA and it's like kind of transforming things. I wonder what would happen if they used psilocybin with couples therapy. If that is, you know, like bringing about all of this love and this openness and like, you know, because what I've heard people say about psilocybin is, you know, you feel one with the universe, which, you know, makes me wonder if that's not why it's so helpful if you're like in a terminal illness, right? Because they've done those studies on people in terminal illness. Like it takes away your fear of death because you're like, well, we're all one, you know, and everything should be just be as it is. And like, there's so much love, you know? So
yeah. And also I think there's something about psilocybin that we feel very small and insignificant, but in a way that's sort of an existential relief. We realize, okay, there is all this life and this planet and all these species, and it's all churning in life and death and time, and we are so insignificant. And it's like, what a relief, because you know, we can all feel so incredibly self-important in the movie of our lives, but there's something about psilocybin as that kind of ego dissolution and sense of oneness. I think that's like, yeah, I am, not only am I deeply connected to everything, but I am very small, and that's good, and that's actually okay. And when I pass and get churned back into dust, like, that's okay. Because that's the natural order of things. And again, it's almost like psilocybin can be like this humility inducer in a good way. It's like, you know what? It's not all about you, Craig, or all about you, Katrina. Like, you guys are just a little piece of something way bigger. And isn't that cool? And isn't that so?
Yeah. And I think it kind of gives up the freedom to go with the flow of life. You know, I think about Taoism, because I've been reading a little bit about Taoism this past year, because I read like the Tao of Pooh. Anyways, it's a great book. But and you know, it's all about just like I think it's called Wu Wei, like just going with the natural flow of life, you know, and how everything like is as it should be, and just go with the flow of life, you know. And it sounds like psilocybin kind of does that in itself, where it's like, it's just, you're just a part of this thing, and that's okay. And it's fine if you got that email. Like, it's not this bigger thing, you know, that we like all stress about and like have all of these like mental health responses to, or mental responses to, you know. I mean, it's just, it seems very freeing. And I think that's really cool, because often, like as a therapist, like a talk therapist, I see people get stuck at a certain point, you know, and it's like, man, if only we could just like expand your mind, because you're only seeing, you know, I explained it to one client once where I felt like he was trapped in like this spider web, you know, and he desperately wanted to get out of his depression. And I'm like, I know you can see that there's something on the other side, but there's a spider web of thoughts, of negativity, of past history and experiences, and who knows, you know, biologically what's going on that like keep you trapped. And it's like psychedelics kind of just like burst a little opening going on that like that perception that you have of the world. So I'm so excited about where this is going, and it's surprising to me that I feel that way, because like I hardly drink alcohol, like I don't do drugs, you know, like I just don't, that's just not my thing. But like learning about this, I'm like, oh whoa, now this is on a different playing field. This is not what I thought was happening in the 70s, you know. Field. So
yeah, I love that.
So I don't remember if I heard it
Yeah, let's do that.
on your podcast first, or if we had talked about it during like one of our mentor sessions, but learning about THC's, like the harm that can come from THC, shook me. I had no idea. I kind of just believed what everyone said, you know, because it's been legalized, so there's like a lot of marketing around it, just being like, oh, THC is great if you have cancer, and you know, all this stuff, like smoke some pot. But learning from you that that's not always the case was really surprising. So can you kind of tell the listeners like what you have discovered, or like what the research is showing?
Yeah. Maybe we should first talk about sort of the terminology. So whether we're, you know, THC, weed, cannabis, marijuana.
Okay.
You know. I think very specifically, I think what we want to talk about the next few minutes is weed. I'm sorry, is THC. because you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s with very low THC weed, if you will. You know, the weed of the 80s was like 3-4%, 5%. 80s was like 3-4%. What that meant was there was in the plant. And you know, back in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, you know, psychotic breaks, manic breaks with cannabis, with weed were very rare, very rare. I mean, in my psychiatric training residency, 2001 to 2005, I don't remember a single case of cannabis-induced psychosis. There might have been, I just can't remember that. And in fact, we learned in my psychiatric residency training that when someone has a psychotic break, like you see that classic case of a young man with psychotic break, that you hope and pray that it's a substance-induced psychosis, because that means when they stop the substance, the psychosis will go away. Mm-hmm. Well, that was true until about 10, 12 years ago. So again, until about 10, 12 years ago, I just didn't really see much psychosis or mania that seems like it was being triggered by weed. But then cannabis was legalized in Colorado. And what happened with that was very interesting. I don't think anybody guessed this, but there was really, I would call it like an arms race, if you will, to create the most powerful cannabis/THC products that they could. And what happened was, with selective breeding, the cannabis strains got stronger, 24, 26, 28, 35% by weight THC. And then also there became a whole market for THC extracts, pure THC, vape pens, concentrates. And more people, not only did they start using higher and higher concentration flower, but they started using THC concentrates. Then this triggered what has been a total game change, sea change in psychiatry in Colorado, is that now in the last 10 years, again, I'm going to say THC-induced psychosis or mania, because that's what it is. It's not like marijuana/cannabis. That's not necessarily the problem. I mean, some of those super strains are, but the people that are really getting into trouble are the people who are using the pure THC products. And, you know, where they can end up using hundreds of milligrams a day. And it's triggering not only psychotic and manic episodes, but it's triggering chronic psychotic illnesses that don't resolve. Again, in my residency, we learned that if someone has a substance-induced psychosis, that's hopeful because they stop the substance, it'll go away. Now I'm seeing in Colorado, someone has a substance-induced psychosis, which again is usually now THC, often THC concentrates. It doesn't go away. In fact, what it is, more often than not, is it's the kind of the final straw that seems to trigger an underlying bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, or schizophrenia. And so now when I have, again, often young men in my office with their first or second psychotic break, and they're using a lot of THC products, often the THC concentrates, I'm kind of settling into this reality that what we're seeing now is that the THC has uncovered schizophrenia or some other devastating illness. And now yet I'm trying to convince my, again, often young patients, you cannot use any more THC because it will make your illness so hard to treat, and it will make it much more likely that you decompensate into psychosis and mania. But the problem is here we have not only medicalized THC slash cannabis in Colorado, but the dispensaries have green crosses, and the dispensaries are called like Green Med and Green Cure and Natural Cure, and you can get a medical card in Colorado so you can get cheaper THC products to treat your various illnesses, including psychiatric illnesses. So it's like we are going against this whole industry in Colorado that is promoting THC slash weed as a medicine, as a therapeutic thing. And again, I know that there are people whose medical conditions are helped by THC and cannabis. I'm not disputing that. But what I'm saying is, in psychiatry, the people we see with some of the most severe, scary, life-threatening, life-wrecking conditions, THC is arguably the worst possible thing they could be doing. And so, I spend a lot of my clinical time and energy trying to convince my people not to use any THC products, much less the concentrates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And have you found any resistance to that when you bring it up?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. So one is that the cultural acceptance of weed slash THC, and that it's really advertised and promoted not just as a safe recreational thing, but as a medicinal thing. Mm-hmm. I've talked about in my podcast, if I were the health czar of Colorado, I would get rid of medical marijuana. I would just have recreational, because I really think we should think about weed like alcohol. It's not evil or necessarily bad for everyone, but there are people who should not drink, and there are definitely people who should not use THC slash cannabis. So I'm trying to convince, so I'm working against that kind of social construct that weed is medical. But then the other thing is, most people, and what does that mean? 90% of people or more can use even the THC concentrates and not develop a psychotic or manic episode. But, there's some percentage of people, is it, 4%, 6%-ish, who are actually at very significant risk of developing not only a psychotic episode, but a kind of breaking loose a chronic psychotic illness. And so I think a lot of my patients are looking at all their friends who are using huge amounts of THC concentrates and or flower, and like, well, look at them, they're fine. Like they're not going psychotic. And so I have to spend a lot of energy trying to say, our brains are all different. And there are actually, we've identified at least a couple genes that seem to predispose people to not just psychosis and mania from THC, but developing bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. So there seems to be about 3.5% of the population, at least, that has a genetic susceptibility to chronic psychosis. And those also seem to be the people who are at high risk of decompensating, including, chronically with THC. So again, my patients are looking around like, wait, the culture is saying weed is medicinal. My friends are all smoking it. Nobody else is flipping out. So I think you're wrong, Heacock. I think it's not the weed. But then after, sometimes we'll have 2, 3, 4 psychotic breaks, and hospitalizations, then hopefully I convince people, okay, can we try this with no THC? Can we just treat you? Can you lay off this? And what people usually find is they are much more stable and healthy and functioning if they have one of those diagnoses, if they leave THC behind.
Is there any way that like the people listening can see if they're higher at risk? Because for me, as soon as I learned that, I mean, well, I've only tried weed like twice, and I had a panic attack one of the times, so I was like, never again. But it definitely put me off of it, because I'm like, how do I know if this would trigger it for me? So is there anything that they can look into, like their family history or medical conditions?
That's right there. Yeah, I think genetic testing is coming soon that will clarify this further, but basically, no, family history is huge. And there's some really interesting studies on that. If there are people in your family who have had bona fide bipolar disorder, who have had psychotic or manic episodes from drugs, who have had other psychotic illnesses, your risk of having genetic susceptibility to THC and THC-induced psychosis and mania is probably significantly higher. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a family history of psychosis or mania or substance-induced psychosis or mania, you probably are okay. But again, in the interest of harm reduction, when I'm talking to people about weed, again, I'm constantly talking to people about THC and weed, I'm always urging people, like, look, if you're going to smoke weed, smoke flower. Don't use THC concentrates, because I really think THC concentrates are kind of the alcohol equivalent of Everclear. One of the things like we hopefully teaching our kids and young people, like if you're going to drink, don't drink Everclear, don't guzzle vodka, don't guzzle tequila, drink wine or beer, or be careful, because hard liquor can lead to really big problems. Can flower, including the high-potency flower, can that lead to psychiatric problems? Yes. But I would argue not nearly as frequently as people who are using the THC concentrates. So a lot of what I do with people is saying, look, we don't exactly know how much THC might be worsening or causing your psychiatric situation. If you're not willing to quit, could you at least think harm reduction wise and lay off the THC concentrates? Mm-hmm. But it's interesting. I've realized now, I've asked everybody for years, do you smoke weed? But now I've realized, like, especially my young people, I mean, I could ask that question, but now I ask specifically, do you use THC concentrates? Because a lot of my people were saying, oh no, I don't smoke weed. But they vape THC from their vape pen, hundreds of milligrams a day.
Yeah.
So, and that's, again, way more dangerous. So it's just the way we ask about substance use, I think, has really had to change in Colorado, because the way so many young people are using THC is not what we would expect.
Yeah. Wow. That's so helpful for me too, as a therapist, to figure out like what it is that my clients are using and things like that, because sometimes I see, like hallucinations or things starting to pop up, and I'm like, ooh, how much of this is substance use and whatever. And, I don't ever ask about THC concentrate. So now I know to ask that. So thank you for that one, because I will definitely ask, because, they'll just be like, yeah, I don't do anything. I'm fine. And I'm like, ooh, actually. Okay. So
well, even when people talk, about vaping, because a lot of my young people, like, I vape, I think the follow-up question, which I've learned, needs to be, do you mean nicotine or do you mean THC? Because a lot of times now, vaping used to mean nicotine, but more and more vaping means THC. It means a THC pen. And again, though, with those THC pens, you can sometimes get hundreds of milligrams in your system a day, which is potentially destabilizing for a lot of people. But again, if you have any kind of genetic susceptibility to serious psychiatric illness, I mean, you are playing with fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. Very helpful. So as we're nearing the end, I have one final question for you. Mm-hmm. I am a huge fan of Carl Rogers, and I love his book on becoming a person. And one of the things that he talks about there is the secret to a good life. So what do you think is the secret to a good life?
I think the secret to a good life is connection. And I mean, in all senses of that word, I mean, connection to nature and to your pets and to your loved ones and your friends. And, they often talk about in 12-step programs that the opposite of addiction is connection. I just love that, because, people show up, I mean, addiction just disconnects you from everything, including yourself. And when people get healthy in recovery, they get reconnected to themselves and their families and their loved ones and their friends and their community. So I think the key to a good life is connection.
Perfect. I love that. Awesome. Well, how can people learn more about you? So can you kind of talk a little bit about like your website, your podcast, anything else that you might have going on?
Sure, love to. I have a psychiatric storytelling podcast called Back from the Abyss, and that's on all the podcast platforms. We just finished year 5.
Woo-hoo.
Published the final episode of season 5 just published today. And my website's craigheacockmd.com, so people can learn more about me there and also access Back from the Abyss. And yeah, I hope people check out the podcast. It's a little bit like This American Life meets psychiatry, or The Moth meets psychiatry, because while there is a lot of information about psychiatry on there, there's also a lot of beautiful, moving stories.
Mm-hmm. I love the stories that you have on there. That's how I met you, is through your podcast, and it's been amazing. I love it. So you guys should definitely check it out. All right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, for having me. Thank you so much for being on here. It was awesome. So
yeah, I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for joining me on today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more interviews like this and more episodes where I talk about a whole bunch of stuff related to mental health and the healing journey. As a reminder, I am a therapist, but I am not your therapist. Therefore, this is not therapeutic advice. So if you would like guidance on that, check out the links below. See you guys next time.